As the warm late-afternoon sun dipped lower, its golden rays stretched across the familiar streets of a small southern town. Daniel "Danny" Reed, a respected 68-year-old Vietnam veteran, walked at a steady, unhurried pace. Age had slowed his steps, but his upright posture and dignified presence commanded respect wherever he went. He was well known in the town, not just for his military service, but for his quiet dedication to the community, helping those around him whenever he could. Today had been a good day for Danny. He had spent hours at the local Veterans Hall, sharing coffee and old stories with his lifelong friends, swapping memories of times long past. He enjoyed the peaceful simplicity of his life now, a life that allowed him to spend quiet afternoons reminiscing. But as he strolled through the town square, something unusual caught his eye, breaking the routine calm of his day. Near one of the benches across the park, Danny noticed a small group of people beginning to gather. Curious, he squinted to make out what was happening. In the center of the growing crowd, Officer Troy Mitchell, a stocky, intimidating figure, loomed over a young man who looked cornered and visibly anxious. Danny recognized Troy immediately. He had a reputation in the town for escalating situations rather than calming them. Troy was a long-serving officer known for his aggressive, confrontational approach, especially with younger residents or anyone who didn't look like him. The young man Troy was addressing looked barely out of his teens, standing stiff and tense as Troy's voice rose. Though Danny couldn't hear the exact words, he could tell the young man was afraid. His hands shook as he fumbled to pull something out of his pocket, and a heavy tension hung in the air, thick and unmistakable. Danny glanced at the small group of bystanders. They looked uncertain, unsure whether to intervene or to step back. Sighing, Danny moved toward the scene, instinctively feeling that whatever was unfolding wasn't going to end well. As he approached, he kept his voice calm, but loud enough to carry. "Is everything all right here, officer?" Officer Troy's head snapped around to Danny, his eyes narrowing as he took in the older man stepping forward. "Stay out of this, Reed," he barked, his voice sharp and dismissive. "Keep walking." Ignoring the harsh command, Danny focused on the young man, who looked terrified and vulnerable. The boy had finally managed to pull out an ID, his hands trembling as he held it out for Troy to inspect. Troy snatched it from his hand, barely glancing at it before carelessly stuffing it into his pocket. "I'm just passing by," Danny said evenly, his tone gentle, "and it doesn't look like this young man is causing any trouble." But Troy's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening in frustration. Danny could see that he wasn't just dealing with a temperamental cop. He was looking at someone who seemed ready to unleash pent-up anger. Danny held his ground, hoping his presence might help diffuse the situation before it got worse. He wasn't sure what had set Troy off, but it was clear that something had. And it was equally clear that the young man wasn't the real problem here. The crowd around them held their breaths, watching as Danny faced off with the officer. Daniel held his gaze steady, his tone calm. "Doesn't seem like the young man's causing any trouble, officer," he said. The officer, Troy Mitchell, scowled in response, his jaw tightening with irritation. Daniel could tell that Troy wasn't just a cop asserting authority, he was a man looking for a reason to vent whatever was simmering beneath the surface. "I told you, Reed," Troy snarled, stepping closer, his voice like a warning. "This is none of your concern." His stance was confrontational, his broad frame leaning forward, attempting to intimidate Daniel with sheer physical presence. But Daniel, a man who had weathered far greater storms, stood rooted, unmoved by Troy's threat. "I've seen plenty of situations like this," Daniel replied, his voice calm but unyielding. "And I know when things are about to go south." Troy's face reddened, a mixture of anger and frustration flashing across his eyes. He was used to being in control, but here in front of a growing crowd, that control felt threatened. And Daniel's calm presence only seemed to stoke Troy's ire. Daniel represented a challenge to his authority, a reminder that not everyone would cower under his gaze. Around them, the onlookers shifted nervously, the tension between the two men building, like a wire stretched to its breaking point. Daniel held his ground, speaking in a voice that carried both strength and conviction. "There's no need for violence here," he said, his gaze locked firmly on Troy's. "Just let the boy go. Doesn't look like he's done anything wrong." But that was all it took. Something in Troy snapped, and before Daniel could brace himself, Troy shoved him hard. Daniel stumbled back, catching himself as the crowd gasped, startled by the sudden escalation. He straightened up slowly, feeling a familiar ache in his joints, but he didn't back down. Every part of his being told him to let it go, to turn around and walk away. But his conscience told him otherwise. Sometimes there were moments when you had to stand your ground, and Daniel knew this was one of them. "You need to back off, officer," Daniel said quietly, his voice low but unwavering. It was the voice of a man who had faced down real danger and wasn't afraid of a confrontation. But Troy wasn't listening anymore. His fists clenched, his stance rigid with pent-up anger. Suddenly, without warning, Troy's fist flew forward, connecting squarely with Daniel's face. The force of the punch sent Daniel stumbling back, and he crumpled as he hit the pavement with a sickening thud. His head struck the ground, a sharp crack echoing through the silence. For a moment, everything froze. The crowd, paralyzed with shock, stared in horror as blood began to pool beneath Daniel's head. The sight of this once strong, dignified man lying motionless on the ground was a chilling reminder of the violence that had just unfolded. Then, chaos erupted. People rushed forward, some kneeling beside Daniel, while others pulled out their phones, recording the shocking scene as it unfolded. Troy, his face pale and his breaths coming quickly, took a step back, the sudden violence seeming to surprise even him. His mind raced, scrambling to regain control of the situation, to make sense of what he had done. Instinctively, he grabbed his radio, his voice shaking as he barked for backup. He knew he had to get ahead of this, to spin the story before anyone else could. Already, his mind began crafting a defense, a version of events where Daniel had been the aggressor, and Troy had only acted in self-defense. But Troy didn't know that the wheels of something much bigger than him had just been set in motion. His actions had sparked a fire he couldn't possibly control or contain. As the chaos continued to unfold, Daniel lay still on the ground, his once strong form looking frail, almost lifeless. Blood trickled from a gash on the back of his head, pooling beneath him on the unforgiving pavement. A few bystanders a woman's panicked voice cut through the shocked silence, her words trembling as she shouted, "Someone call an ambulance." Nearby, the young man at the center of the original confrontation remained frozen, his eyes wide with terror as he looked at Officer Troy Mitchell, who now stood over Daniel's still body, visibly shaken. Troy's chest rose and fell rapidly, his fists clenched at his sides, as if still prepared to strike. Yet the aggression that had fueled him moments earlier now shifted into something colder, more calculating. Troy fumbled with his radio, his voice unsteady as he barked for backup. "We've got an injured suspect. Need medical assistance at the park," he said, his words laced with a lie he hoped would shield him from consequences. He glanced at the growing crowd, who were watching him with a mix of horror and disbelief, and squared his shoulders, attempting to regain control over the chaotic situation. But he could feel that any authority he'd held had already slipped beyond his grasp. One by one, the bystanders raised their phones, capturing the grim scene. Daniel Reed, a respected veteran, lay motionless on the ground, with Troy standing over him, pale and shaken. It was a scene destined to spread far beyond the park, capturing the attention of all who saw it. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, and within moments paramedics arrived, hurrying to kneel beside Daniel. One of them, a young man with urgency in his eyes, quickly checked Daniel's pulse, his movements efficient and focused. "Got a pulse, but he's in bad shape," he murmured to his partner. "Head injury, possible trauma to the brain, we need to move him now." Carefully, the paramedics lifted Daniel onto a stretcher, his limp body a stark contrast to the vibrant figure he had been just moments before. The crowd murmured in hushed tones, their faces etched with disbelief and sorrow. Daniel was known to them all, respected, even admired. To see him lying there, hurt so brutally, was almost too much for them to process. It was as though a cherished pillar of the community had been toppled in an instant. As the paramedics wheeled Daniel toward the ambulance, his breathing shallow, they fitted him with an oxygen mask to stabilize him as best they could. Just before they closed the ambulance doors, someone in the crowd called out, "Will he be okay?" The paramedic's face was grim as he replied, "I don't know." With that, the ambulance sped away, its sirens piercing the air as it disappeared down the street. The tension in the park lingered, hanging thick and heavy among those who remained. Troy stood alone now, his earlier panic hardening into a rigid determination. He felt the weight of the crowd's stares, the judgment in their silent, watchful eyes. For a moment, his hand twitched toward his holster, a habit of control, but he stopped himself, realizing that the situation had already spiraled far beyond anything he could contain. Suddenly, a man stepped forward from the crowd, his voice calm but loud enough to be heard by everyone. "That wasn't self-defense, officer. We all saw what you did." The crowd seemed to inhale as one, their eyes flicking from the man back to Troy, the unspoken accusations thickening the air. Murmurs rose as people glanced at one another, their expressions a mixture of anger and fear. Though no one spoke the words aloud, the accusations were clear. "Back off," Troy barked, his voice attempting to hold its usual authority. He interfered in police business, but the crowd didn't back down. His words, which had once carried weight, now fell flat, void of power. The onlookers continued to hold their phones aloft, recording every word, every expression, every twitch of his tense, rigid posture. Troy's composure continued to fray as he tried to maintain a semblance of control, but it was too late. The trust, the power he had taken for granted, was gone. He could feel the community turning against him, a wall of silent condemnation. The weight of their judgment pressed down on him, and for the first time he felt truly vulnerable. Exposed under the scrutiny of the very people he was supposed to protect. The moments stretched in an agonizing stillness, each second amplifying the reality of what had happened. This was no longer something he could sweep aside or control with a well-placed excuse. This was the beginning of something bigger than him, something he couldn't contain or evade. As Troy's gaze flicked from one recording phone to the next, his confidence faltered. For all his years in uniform, he had never been so alone. The crowd didn't respond to Troy's harsh commands. Phones remained raised, recording each movement, each desperate flicker of his expression. He could feel his authority slipping like sand through his fingers, and a deep, twisting knot settled in his stomach as he realized just how quickly this situation could spiral out of control. Turning his back on the crowd, Troy began pacing in short, tense steps, mind racing as he tried to piece together his story. He needed to be ready by the time backup arrived, before other officers could see the full reality of what had happened here. When the police chief, Harold Grant, arrived minutes later, Troy wasted no time. He stepped forward, keeping his voice low as he quickly began. "It got out of hand, Chief. The guy, Reed, he stepped in while I was questioning the kid. He got aggressive. I had no choice but to defend myself." Chief Grant, a seasoned officer with more years on the force than most, looked at Troy for a long, hard moment. His gaze flicked to the bloodstain on the pavement where Daniel Reed had fallen, then back to the small crowd of onlookers who remained rooted in place, watching them with a mix of outrage and fear. Grant's jaw tightened. He sensed that this situation was far beyond anything they could control with a simple explanation. "Doesn't matter what your story is, Mitchell," Chief Grant muttered, his voice low enough for only Troy to hear. "This is going to be a mess, and you'd better hope your version holds up." The chief turned, gesturing to one of the newly arrived officers. "Clear the area," he commanded, his voice firm, brooking no argument. Troy swallowed, feeling his pulse race as the adrenaline of the moment caught up with him. He'd handled difficult situations before, but this was different. This wasn't some minor dispute turned sour. The more he stood there, the more he realized just how badly he had misjudged his actions and the outcome. By that evening, word of the incident had already spread like wildfire. Clips of the altercation were circulating on social media, with grainy videos showing Daniel stepping in calmly, only to be met with Troy's brutal assault. The video footage left little room for ambiguity, sparking outrage almost immediately. Residents poured into the town square, demanding answers. Hastily scrawled signs reading "Justice for Daniel" were held high as protesters chanted for Troy's suspension and a full investigation. The narrative of an honorable veteran being attacked in broad daylight struck a deep chord with the community. For many, it confirmed a lingering unease about certain officers on the force, worries that, until now, had remained mostly unspoken. Those whispers of police brutality, of unchecked power, were now rising into full-blown demands for accountability and justice. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Daniel's condition took a turn for the worse. Doctors worked tirelessly to relieve the swelling in his brain, but the prognosis remained grim. His injuries were severe, and within hours he had slipped into a coma, his body unresponsive. What should have been a place of healing had transformed into a room holding the thin line between life and death, filled with the quiet, urgent efforts of medical staff trying to keep him stable. Outside the hospital, a small crowd gathered as night fell, holding a silent vigil for Daniel. Friends, family, and fellow veterans from his community stood together, their faces etched with a blend of grief, rage, and disbelief. These were men and women who had known Daniel for years, who had fought beside him, laughed with him, and respected his unwavering sense of right and wrong. The sight of him lying so vulnerable, so deeply wounded, was almost too much to bear. As the night wore on, an unsettling realization took hold among them all. This wasn't something that would simply pass. The outrage, the sorrow, the call for justice, this would not be easily forgotten. Daniel Reed, the man they had respected and trusted, now lay between life and death, caught in a nightmare that had shaken his community to its core. The town had reached a boiling point. Early one evening, Elijah Reed's phone buzzed, pulling him away from the documents scattered across his desk. He was in his office, its walls lined with plaques, awards, and degrees, a testament to the dedication that had brought him to his role as State Attorney General. Elijah was no stranger to calls at all hours. His position made him the first point of contact for cases involving civil rights abuses, complex legal issues, and sometimes even political tensions. But this call was different. He picked up, his tone brisk and professional. "Reed here," he said. On the other end, a shaky voice stammered, "Mr. Reed, I don't know how to say this, but it's about your father." Elijah's heart skipped, his usual composed exterior cracked, his voice strained as he asked, "My father? What happened?" The caller rushed through her explanation, words tumbling over each other in urgency. "There was an incident. He was hurt badly. He's in the hospital, in a coma. There was a confrontation with a police officer." The news hit Elijah like a freight train. His father, Daniel Reed, the man who had been a rock in his life, who had survived the horrors of war and dedicated his years to helping others, was now lying in a hospital bed, barely clinging to life. Elijah sat motionless, struggling to grasp the enormity of what he'd just heard. A police officer had attacked his father. His father, now in a coma. The thought was incomprehensible. "Are you still there, Mr. Reed?" the voice on the other end asked hesitantly. "I'm here," Elijah replied, his voice low and calm despite the storm brewing inside him. "I'm coming." As he ended the call, his hand trembled slightly. He sat at his desk, thoughts racing, piecing together what this truly meant. This wasn't some tragic accident or random misfortune. His father had been harmed by someone within the very system meant to protect him. And now, he was lying unconscious, fighting for his life. Elijah's mind churned. The officer, whoever he was, had no idea what he'd just set in motion. He didn't know that the man he'd hurt was the father of the state's top law enforcement official, someone who had spent his entire career fighting for justice and accountability. Without another moment's hesitation, Elijah stood, pulling his jacket from the back of his chair. His mind sharpened, already shifting into action mode. This wasn't just another case. This time, it was personal. He had encountered similar cases of police misconduct and cover-ups, watched the truth be twisted and buried, until someone strong enough came along to fight it. This time, that someone would be him, and there would be no sweeping this incident under any rug. The familiar, calm environment of his office suddenly felt too quiet, the air heavy with anticipation. It was the silence before a storm. He realized that he wasn't simply going to the hospital as a worried family member. He was going as Attorney General, a man with the power to expose the corruption festering in his own state systems. Grabbing his briefcase, Elijah headed toward the door. He'd go to the hospital first to see his father, but after that, there would be no mercy for those responsible. Every officer involved, every person who had stood by and allowed this to happen, would be held accountable. It was nearly nightfall when Elijah Reed arrived at the hospital. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, yet his face remained a mask of calm control. Years of legal battles and public service had trained him well, teaching him to compartmentalize, to contain emotions until it was time to act. But as he stepped into his father's hospital room and saw Daniel Reed, the man who had taught him to fight for justice, who had always been his pillar of strength, lying motionless, Elijah felt an ache he hadn't anticipated. Daniel looked so small and fragile on the hospital bed, pale and still, with tubes running from his arms. The steady beeping of the monitors filled the silence, each sound like a ticking clock, counting down the moments Elijah had left to make things right. At the edge of the room, Elijah stood with his fists clenched, struggling to hold his emotions at bay. A nurse entered quietly, her expression somber. "He's stable for now," she said gently, though her voice carried the weight of uncertainty. "But the head injury? It's serious. We're doing everything we can." Elijah nodded, his gaze fixed on his father's face. "Thank you," he replied, his voice rough but controlled. She offered a sympathetic smile before slipping out, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He could hear nothing but the rhythmic beeping, his mind replaying the words he'd heard over the phone. Police officer, altercation, coma. A cop had done this to his father. A man sworn to protect others had brought harm to someone who embodied decency and honor. The hypocrisy was staggering. Elijah inhaled sharply, the anger simmering beneath his calm demeanor flaring up again. His father, a man who had served his country with dignity, now lay in a hospital bed because of someone who had used their power to hurt instead of help. Yet Elijah knew he couldn't allow his emotions to control him. There was too much work to be done, and he couldn't afford to falter now. By the time Elijah stepped outside the hospital, news of the incident had already spread like wildfire. A large crowd was gathering in front of the police station, people holding hastily made signs with "Justice for Daniel" scrawled across them. The town, and soon the entire state, was watching closely. Videos of the incident were going viral, sparking outrage and demands for accountability. Elijah's face was familiar to many, and as he approached the crowd, reporters instantly recognized him. Questions rose around him like a swarm, cameras capturing his every movement. Several reporters pushed to the front, their microphones held high as they called out, "Mr. Reed, can you comment on your father's condition? What's your response to the officer's actions?" Elijah straightened, his voice cutting through the noise with calm authority. "My father is in critical condition," he said, his tone measured but laced with unmistakable anger. "There will be a full investigation, and I won't rest until the truth is exposed and justice is served." The crowd hushed, and reporters furiously scribbled notes, cameras rolling, as they captured the weight behind Elijah's words. Without another word, he turned and walked toward his car. His legal team had already been alerted, working quickly to assemble evidence and prepare for the battle that lay ahead. Elijah had seen how the system could fail, how cover-ups and false narratives could twist the truth. But this time, it was personal. And he was determined to confront the system that had allowed this to happen. The officer who had put Elijah's father in that hospital bed had no idea what was coming. The next morning, an unsettling weight seemed to hang over the town. Daniel Reed's face, a man known for his service, his quiet strength, was splashed across news networks, and the image of him lying unconscious in the park became a powerful symbol. But for Elijah Reed, it was far more than a symbol or a headline. This was his father. The reality of that fact pressed heavily on him as he sat in his office, his team gathered around, reviewing every piece of evidence they'd gathered so far. Elijah had stayed up all night, poring over witness statements, video footage of the attack, and reports filed by the police department. The picture coming together was grim. Officer Troy Mitchell had used excessive force, and his father was now in a coma because of it. But Elijah knew that the problem went much deeper than just one officer. "Troy's been a problem for a long time," Elijah's legal advisor said, flipping through Mitchell's personnel file, which had been sent over by a whistleblower in the department. "There are multiple complaints, excessive force, harassment, racial bias, all swept under the rug. He's been protected." Elijah's jaw tightened. "How far back do these complaints go?" he asked. Years, his advisor replied. Most complaints never even made it to the review board, but with the video evidence and the public outcry now, they won't be able to cover it up this time. Elijah nodded, absorbing the implications. This was no longer just about one officer. It was about the entire department's culture of protectionism, a system that had allowed officers like Troy Mitchell to operate without consequences for far too long. He glanced once more at the footage of the attack. The moment when Troy's fist connected with his father's face, the sickening sight of Daniel falling, the blood pooling beneath his head. It was a scene he would never be able to forget. "We'll press charges against Mitchell," Elijah said, his voice firm and steady. "But we're not stopping there. I want a full investigation into how the department handled these complaints. If there's corruption, we'll expose it, and anyone who covered for him is going down with him." His team nodded, their faces set with resolve. They knew Elijah wasn't one to back down when it came to justice. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Troy Mitchell was sitting in the police station, his nerves frayed as he watched the fallout from the incident unfold. News reports were relentless, his name plastered across headlines as his actions were dissected by nearly every media outlet in the state. The town was in an uproar, and protesters had gathered outside the station, demanding his arrest. Troy was no stranger to trouble. But this was different. This was spiraling out of control. "Troy, you've got to lay low for a while," the police chief, Harold Grant, said, pacing back and forth in front of him. "This is turning into a storm, and the Attorney General is on this. Elijah Reed's his son, for God's sake." "How was I supposed to know?" Troy snapped, the panic creeping into his voice. "How was I supposed to know?" Troy Mitchell snapped, panic creeping into his voice. "He didn't say anything, he just stepped in and I—" The police chief, Harold Grant, cut him off, his tone harsh. "You think that's going to matter, Troy? You think anyone's going to care what he said or didn't say?" He crossed his arms, his face a mixture of frustration and resignation. "There are videos, Troy. People saw what you did." Troy slumped back in his chair, rubbing his forehead with his hand. He could feel the walls closing in around him, the weight of the situation pressing down with an unrelenting force. He'd made a monumental mistake, and now he could see no way out of it. Chief Grant sighed, leaning against the desk, still eyeing Troy. "We'll do what we can to protect you," he muttered, though his voice held little conviction. "But with Reed involved—" He trailed off, the unspoken words lingering heavily between them. Both men knew the truth. If Elijah Reed, the Attorney General, was leading this investigation, there would be no shield of protection strong enough to save Troy. Later that afternoon, Elijah held his first press conference on the courthouse steps. Reporters clustered around, cameras flashing, voices rising with eager questions. Despite the chaos, Elijah stood tall, his face composed and calm, though his eyes held a fierce determination that was unmistakable. "I want to be absolutely clear," Elijah began, his voice steady and unyielding. "We will be conducting a thorough investigation into the events that occurred in the park and into the actions of Officer Troy Mitchell. There will be no cover-ups, no protection for those responsible. Justice will be served." The crowd of reporters stilled, pens scratching furiously across their notepads as they absorbed his words. Elijah's reputation preceded him. He was known for his zero-tolerance stance against corruption. And now, with his father lying in a hospital bed, no one doubted that he would pursue this case with relentless force. "We will be pressing charges against Officer Mitchell for the assault on my father, Daniel Reed," Elijah continued. "But this investigation will go beyond the actions of one officer. We are examining how the police department has handled previous complaints against Officer Mitchell and will ensure that any misconduct within the department is exposed." He didn't raise his voice, but the gravity of his words hung in the air like a storm cloud, charged and electric. Elijah wasn't just coming after Mitchell. He was coming after every individual who had allowed this officer to act with impunity. He was determined to expose anyone complicit in the cycle of violence and abuse that had shielded Mitchell for years. A reporter stepped forward, his voice carrying above the murmur of the crowd. "Mr. Reed, can you provide an update on your father's condition?" Elijah's expression softened for a moment, a flicker of raw emotion crossing his face before he collected himself. "My father remains in critical condition," he said quietly. "We are hopeful, but we are prepared for whatever comes next." A heavy silence followed as the reporters exchanged glances. They could see the weight Elijah was carrying, the strain in his eyes, but they also recognized the unwavering resolve that had defined his career. There was no doubt that he would pursue this case with everything he had. The press conference ended shortly after, but Elijah's message was clear. He was on a mission for justice, and nothing, not a corrupt officer, not a complicit department, would stand in his way. Chief Harold Grant stared out his office window, watching the crowd of protesters swelling outside the police station. With each passing hour, the crowd grew larger, and the chants of "Justice for Daniel" echoed through the streets, their voices clear and unrelenting. He turned back to Troy Mitchell, who sat slumped in the corner of the room, his head buried in his hands. Grant's expression was grim as he delivered the hard truth. "We can't protect you from this," he said, voice low. "You're on your own." Troy didn't respond. He barely looked up, his mind spinning with the weight of what was coming. Outside, the chants grew louder, punctuating his thoughts with a haunting certainty. This was only the beginning, and there was no way out. Across town, Elijah Reed sat at his desk, the sound of distant chanting filling his office as he reviewed the thick file in front of him. Days had passed since his father's brutal assault, and although his team had made significant progress in the investigation, the case weighed heavily on him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his father lying motionless in that hospital bed, tubes and machines keeping him alive. The image was haunting, and sleep had become elusive. It was already late afternoon, but the day was far from over. His team was in overdrive, assembling evidence, filing motions, and preparing for what promised to be a long and grueling fight. Too many eyes were on this case, and the stakes were too high for him to falter. The buzz of his phone jolted him from his thoughts. It was one of his lead investigators. "We dug deeper into Mitchell's history," the investigator said, his tone grave. "It's worse than we thought. Not only is there a clear pattern of excessive force, but we found internal memos within the department. The chief knew about his conduct." Elijah's jaw tightened as he gripped the phone. It was one thing to suspect that the department had shielded Troy, but now he had proof. The realization was both staggering and infuriating. Corruption had clearly taken root, allowed to fester within the ranks of law enforcement, and his father had paid the price. "Get me everything," Elijah said, his voice low and firm. "Every memo, every internal report, every document they tried to bury. We'll bring it all to light." "Understood," the investigator replied. After a brief pause, he added, "There's more." Word is the chief's starting to feel the heat. He's worried. "I think we're close to a breakthrough." Elijah ended the call, staring out his own window at the crowd gathered in front of the courthouse. The town was reaching a boiling point, and he knew that if they didn't see justice soon, the tension could erupt in ways he couldn't control. But as determined as he was to dismantle the corruption in the police department, he felt an unfamiliar conflict building within himself. For as long as he could remember, Elijah had prided himself on his methodical, deliberate approach to justice. He'd always kept his emotions in check, never allowing them to interfere with his work. But this case was different. Every step forward, every new piece of evidence his team uncovered, seemed to stoke a fire deep within him. This wasn't just another investigation, it was personal. His father, a man who had served his country with honor, a man who had been a symbol of strength and integrity, now lay in a coma because of a system that had failed him. Elijah's heart ached every time he thought about Daniel. His father had taught him so much, instilling in him a belief in justice, fairness, and the importance of doing what was right. And now, as he prepared to take on a broken system, he felt those lessons echoing back at him with new meaning. Elijah thought about everything his father had taught him over the years: justice, integrity, and the importance of doing what's right, even when it's hard. Throughout his career, Elijah had lived by those values, fighting tirelessly to uphold justice. But now, standing on the brink of exposing the corruption that had shielded his father's attacker, Elijah felt a wave of grief and anger that nearly overwhelmed him. Meanwhile, across town, Troy Mitchell was holed up in the cramped apartment where he'd been hiding for days. The walls seemed to close in on him, as he watched the news tear his reputation apart piece by piece. Every headline, every report, and every angry tweet from the protesters outside the police station painted him as a monster. His suspension from the force had all but confirmed that his career was likely over. The chief had given him little support, suggesting only that he lay low and hope for the best. But Troy knew there was no hiding, not with Elijah Reed leading the charge. His phone buzzed, and for a moment he hesitated before answering. It was his lawyer. "They're coming after you, Troy," the lawyer said, his tone cold and unyielding. "They've got video evidence, and they're digging into your record. There's not much I can do unless you're willing to cut a deal." A chill ran through Troy. "A deal? I can't go to prison," he stammered. "There's not much choice here," the lawyer replied, unflinching. "Reed is building a solid case. If you don't cooperate, they're going to throw everything they've got at you." Troy didn't respond. He knew the lawyer was right, but the reality of what lay ahead terrified him. This wasn't just a public relations crisis anymore. He was facing jail time, real consequences for his actions. And there was no escape. Back at the hospital, Daniel's condition remained unchanged. The doctors were doing everything they could, but his coma was deep, and the prognosis was still uncertain. Friends and fellow veterans continued to take turns keeping vigil at his bedside. A quiet yet unwavering show of solidarity. And every day, Elijah would visit, spending whatever time he could by his father's side. Each visit felt heavier than the last. Daniel, a man who had always been a force of strength in Elijah's life, now lay motionless, barely clinging to life. One evening, Elijah sat by the hospital bed, his hand resting gently on his father's. "Hey, Dad," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm doing everything I can. I'm going to get justice for you, I promise." The machines beeped softly, the steady rhythm of Daniel's heartbeat the only sound in the room. Elijah leaned back in his chair, his eyes burning from exhaustion and grief. There were brief moments when doubt crept in, when he wondered if he truly had the strength to keep going. This case was too personal, and the weight of it sometimes felt crushing. But then he would remember his father's voice, his father's unwavering lessons. "You don't back down from a fight." And with that thought, Elijah knew he would keep pushing forward, no matter the cost. "You don't stop fighting until it's over, son." Those words steadied Elijah, giving him the strength he needed. He wiped his eyes, stood up, and reminded himself that there was still work to be done. As long as his father was fighting to stay alive, Elijah would keep fighting too. When he entered the office of Police Chief Harold Grant, the room felt tighter than usual. Elijah's face was unreadable, yet his presence carried a heavy authority. Grant sat behind his desk with his arms crossed, clearly attempting to maintain control, but the tension in the room was undeniable. The department was under siege, and Grant knew that Elijah wasn't there for pleasantries. Elijah took his time surveying the room, his gaze sweeping over framed accolades, photos of the chief with his officers, and the department's insignia that hung on the wall, symbols of an institution that had failed his father, failed the community, and allowed corruption to fester unchecked. Chief Grant cleared his throat, attempting a strained smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Attorney General Reed, I appreciate you coming by to discuss." "Save it," Elijah cut in, his voice calm but firm, refusing to sit down. "We're not here for small talk." Grant stiffened, his forced smile disappearing. "Now, hold on," he began, defensive. "Mitchell acted on his own. This wasn't some organized conspiracy by the department. The man's always had a temper." "That temper cost my father his life," Elijah interrupted coldly. "And this isn't just about Mitchell. This is about how your department has handled complaints against him, the cover-ups, the silence you allowed to grow under your watch." Grant leaned back, visibly tired, as the gravity of the situation bore down on him. He had known Elijah Reed for years, watched him rise through the ranks to become the state attorney general, but this version of Elijah was new to him. Relentless, unyielding. Elijah didn't pause. "We have evidence, Chief. Internal memos documenting complaints against Mitchell that were dismissed without a proper investigation. Memos with your signature on them." The chief's face went pale. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He could feel the walls closing in. the weight of the damning evidence crushing his defenses. Elijah wasn't bluffing, and Grant knew that if this information came to light, it wouldn't just ruin his career. It would expose the department as a place where corruption had taken root and been allowed to thrive. "We're filing charges against Troy Mitchell for assault and misconduct," Elijah continued, his tone steady and cold. "But it doesn't end there. We're launching a full investigation into your department. Every complaint that was buried, every report that was altered to protect certain officers, it's all going to be brought into the light." Grant shifted in his chair, gripping the edge of his desk as if holding on for balance. "Reed," he muttered, desperation creeping into his voice, "you know how these things work. Sometimes situations get messy. Sometimes we have to protect our own." Elijah's gaze hardened. "Your job wasn't to protect officers who abuse their power. Your job was to protect this community, and you failed." The silence between them stretched, the weight of Elijah's words hanging thick in the air. Chief Grant looked down, the last remnants of his defiance draining away as he saw the truth reflected in Elijah's eyes. There would be no negotiation, no leniency. Elijah Reed was here to expose the rot in his department, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Chief Grant's voice was low and weary. "Sometimes things get messy. Sometimes we have to look out for our own." Elijah's eyes flashed with barely contained anger. "Your job isn't to protect corrupt officers. Your job is to protect this community. You failed at that, and now you're going to face the consequences." A heavy silence filled the room. Grant felt the weight of Elijah's words settle over him like a stone. There was no escape. He could see that now. His mind scrambled to find some kind of defense, a way out of this nightmare, but he could find none. Finally, he slumped back in his chair, defeat etched across his face. "What do you want from me?" he muttered. Elijah's voice didn't waver. "I want full cooperation with this investigation. I want every file, every memo, every email related to Mitchell's misconduct on my desk by the end of the day. And I want your department to issue a public statement acknowledging the failures that led to my father's assault." Grant swallowed hard, realizing he had no other choice. "You'll get it," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. Elijah didn't linger. Without another word, he turned and left, his steps steady and purposeful. Grant remained at his desk, staring at the door as it clicked shut behind Elijah. His career hung by a thread, and his department was on the brink of collapse. Across town, Troy Mitchell sat alone in his dim apartment, drowning in fear. He stared blankly at the wall, his mind numbed by the endless news reports that painted him as a villain, a rogue officer who had put a beloved veteran into a coma. His lawyer had advised him to stay out of sight, but Troy knew hiding wouldn't be enough. He was keenly aware of what awaited him. Elijah Reed had built his career on taking down people like him, officers who thought they could abuse their power without consequences. And now, with Elijah's father lying in a hospital bed, Troy knew the Attorney General would be coming after him with everything he had. Troy's hands shook as he scrolled through the latest barrage of articles on his phone. Each report was worse than the last, recounting not only his most recent actions, but also dredging up his past. They were pulling up every complaint, every instance of overstepping his bounds, and exposing them all. There was nothing he could do to stop it. He thought about the incident, the way he had struck Daniel, the force that sent him to the ground, the sickening crack as his head hit the pavement. Troy hadn't meant for things to go that far. Yes, he'd been angry, but he hadn't intended to put the old man in a coma. But intent didn't matter now. The damage was done, and he knew his time was running out. Back in his office, Elijah stood in front of the large window overlooking the courthouse square. He could feel the momentum shifting, the tide turning as the investigation progressed. His team was uncovering more evidence every day, and each piece was falling neatly into place. Soon there would be nowhere left for Troy Mitchell or anyone else who had shielded him to hide. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was his lead investigator. "We've got what we need," she said, her voice filled with satisfaction. "The chief is cooperating and the files are coming in. We've uncovered even more complaints against Mitchell." The foundation of the case was solidifying, and the truth was finally coming into view. The investigation had revealed even more. Racially motivated stops, excessive force, reports buried deep to shield Officer Troy Mitchell from consequences. And it wasn't just him. The entire department seemed infected by a culture of silence and protectionism. Elijah felt a grim satisfaction as he nodded to his lead investigator. "Good. Keep digging. We're going to dismantle this whole thing." He ended the call and gazed out his office window at the growing crowd of protesters below. The town was on the verge of something big, something that would change it forever, and Elijah was prepared to lead the charge. Outside the courthouse, reporters and protesters swarmed the steps, their voices blending into a single roar. The town was tense, on edge, waiting for one thing: the arrest of Officer Troy Mitchell. Inside, Elijah sat at a table with his legal team, their faces calm and focused. After weeks of tireless investigation, after digging up every buried report and uncovering each complaint against Mitchell, they were finally ready to bring him to justice. Elijah glanced at the thick stack of documents in front of him. The indictment. It had taken days of meticulous review, but the charges were clear: assault, misconduct, and a long history of racially biased behavior that the department had ignored for years. The evidence was overwhelming, leaving no doubt that Mitchell would face the full weight of the law. The door to the room opened, and Elijah's lead investigator walked in, her face tense but resolute. "It's time," she said. Elijah nodded, rising to his feet. He'd waited for this moment, the chance to hold Troy Mitchell accountable for what he had done to his father. But as he walked toward the courtroom, he felt the full weight of the moment press down on him. This wasn't just about Mitchell anymore. It was about an entire broken system, one that had failed his father and countless others. As Officer Troy Mitchell was led toward the courthouse by two officers, the crowd erupted into boos and shouts. The man who had once carried himself with arrogant confidence now looked pale and haunted, his world crumbling around him. The sight of him, his shoulders hunched under the public's fury, only intensified the anger of the protesters. Their chants echoed in his ears, their stares burning into him like physical blows. This wasn't how Troy had thought things would end. He'd believed he could lie his way out of this, that the department would protect him as they always had. But as he neared the courthouse steps, he realized the truth. They were throwing him to the wolves. The officers escorting him said nothing. There was no camaraderie, no sense of loyalty or protection left. He was alone now, just as Chief Grant had warned him he would be. His hands were shackled, and his mind spun as he tried to understand where everything had gone so terribly wrong. Inside the courtroom, Elijah stood tall as the judge entered. The room was packed with reporters, town officials, and several familiar faces, friends of his father, veterans who had stood by Daniel throughout his life. They were there to see justice, and Elijah was determined to give it to them. Elijah Reed stood in the courtroom, resolved not to let the people down. The judge cleared her throat, her voice echoing through the tense silence as she began. "We are here to formally indict Officer Troy Mitchell on charges of felony assault, official misconduct, and civil rights violations. The court will now proceed with the reading of the charges." As the charges were read aloud, Elijah kept his gaze fixed on Troy. There was no fight left in him, no trace of his once arrogant demeanor. Troy sat motionless, his face pale, eyes staring blankly ahead as the weight of the indictment pressed down on him. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The video footage, witness testimonies, and internal reports the department had buried. It was all out in the open now. There was no escape. When the judge finished, Troy's lawyer rose, looking resigned. "We waive the reading of the indictment, Your Honor," he said quietly. "My client understands the charges." A heavy silence filled the courtroom as all eyes turned to Troy. Shackled and defeated, he was led back out of the room. The formal indictment was complete, and Troy Mitchell would now face trial. There was no cheering, no applause inside the room, just the somber acknowledgement of the magnitude of what had been done. But outside, it was a different story. The moment the news broke of Troy's indictment, the crowd gathered outside the courthouse erupted in cheers. For the first time in weeks, there was a glimmer of hope. Hope that justice could be served, that the system could be reformed, that the corruption that had allowed officers like Troy to operate unchecked would finally be dismantled. Elijah stepped out of the courthouse and onto the steps, where the crowd and cameras were waiting. Reporters leaned forward, eager to capture his every word. He held up his hand and the crowd fell silent. "This is just the beginning," Elijah said, his voice calm but filled with resolve. "Officer Troy Mitchell will face trial for his actions, and we will ensure that justice is served. But this isn't just about one officer. This is about a system that allowed this to happen. A system that failed my father and failed this community." The crowd listened intently, hanging on to every word. Elijah continued, "We are conducting a full investigation into the police department's handling of complaints. Anyone who participated in the cover-up, anyone who turned a blind eye, will be held accountable. There will be reforms. There will be change. This community deserves better, and we will not stop until those responsible for these failures are brought to justice." The crowd erupted once more, cheers and applause filling the air. The fight wasn't over. But this was a victory, a first step toward the justice they had been demanding. Back at the police station, Chief Grant sat in his office, staring blankly at the wall. The files had been handed over, the cover-up exposed, and his role in shielding Troy Mitchell had been laid bare. The department was in shambles, and the protests outside had become a daily reminder of just how deeply things had gone wrong. Grant knew his days were numbered. The investigation into the department was only going to intensify. It was only a matter of time before he would be forced to step down. In Elijah Reed's relentless pursuit, every misstep, every failure was coming to light. The tide had turned and a new era of accountability was beginning. The department's reputation was now in ruins. Chief Grant leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of his choices pressing down on him. Every decision, every time he had looked the other way, it was all catching up to him now, and he was paying the price. As Elijah Reed left the courthouse, his phone buzzed. He saw the hospital's number flash on the screen and his heart sank. "Mr. Reed, it's about your father," came the voice of a nurse, gentle but firm. Elijah's hands trembled as he tightened his grip on the phone. The nurse repeated, "Your father's condition has changed. You should come as soon as you can." For a moment, Elijah stood frozen on the courthouse steps, his mind reeling. His father, Daniel, had been in a coma for weeks. Though his condition had stabilized, the doctors had warned him that things could change at any time. He tried to brace himself for this moment, yet somehow it still caught him off guard. His car sped through the town as the streets blurred past him, the sounds of chanting protesters fading in the distance. The hospital loomed ahead, the same place he'd visited every day since the attack, hoping to see signs of improvement. Each visit, Daniel had looked the same, still, quiet, unchanged. But now, something was different. The nurses guided him to the familiar room. Daniel lay there as always, the machines beeping rhythmically, keeping pace with his shallow breaths. A doctor stood by, his expression carefully neutral. "He's stable for now," the doctor began, but then hesitated before continuing with a sigh. "His brain activity is minimal. If there's no improvement soon, you may need to consider your options." Elijah's breath caught in his throat. All the legal battles, the indictments, the pursuit of reforms, it all felt small in comparison to the fragility of life in this room. He had fought for justice, for accountability. But what about the person lying here? What about his father, the man who had raised him, taught him right from wrong, and never to back down from a fight? Elijah sat by his father's side, the hum of the machines fading into the background. For the first time since the incident, he felt truly overwhelmed, not by the expectations of justice, but by the raw grief and fear of possibly losing his father. He hadn't been ready to say goodbye. So much of his focus had been on fighting the system, on seeking reform, that he hadn't prepared himself for the possibility that Daniel might never wake up. He gently squeezed his father's hand, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm still fighting for you, Dad. We're getting justice. But I need you to come back. I need you here." The steady beeping of the machines remained unchanged, filling the room with an unyielding rhythm. Outside, the town was still pulsing with the impact of the indictment. The protests had grown, and for the first time in a long while, they were filled with hope. Troy Mitchell's trial was set, and the community believed that finally, change was possible. But Elijah knew one indictment wouldn't be enough. His team continued to uncover the department's records, revealing a pattern of neglect and misconduct that had gone on for years. Officers with repeated complaints of racial bias and excessive force had been shielded time and again, and Elijah was determined to expose it all. The culture of silence and complicity that had protected officers guilty of force and misconduct had been pervasive. Leadership had shielded these officers from consequences, and the entire department had operated under a code of silence that let injustices thrive. Elijah's legal team was preparing a comprehensive report, one that would force the department to confront its failures. The police chief's role in covering up misconduct was now public knowledge, and calls for his resignation grew louder by the day. The town was ready for change, and Elijah was determined to see it through. A few days later, the crowd gathered once more in front of the courthouse, this time for a different reason. After days of mounting pressure, Chief Grant had announced his resignation. His departure was seen as a victory for the community, a sign that real change was finally taking hold. Standing on the courthouse steps, Elijah addressed the crowd. So far, he had kept his promises. Troy Mitchell had been indicted, the chief had resigned, and the investigation into the department continued. But Elijah knew the journey was far from over. The indictment of Officer Mitchell and the resignation of Chief Grant are steps toward justice, Elijah said, his voice steady and resolute. But we are not done. My office is committed to ensuring a thorough reform of this police department so that corruption and misconduct like this can never happen again. The crowd cheered, a palpable sense of triumph in the air, but Elijah remained focused, knowing that true justice meant more than just punishing the guilty. It was about building a system that was fair, just, and equitable, a system the community could trust. As the crowd began to disperse, a familiar figure approached Elijah from the side of the courthouse steps. It was Maya Torres, a local civil rights activist. She had been instrumental in organizing protests and maintaining pressure on the department in the weeks following the attack on Daniel. Extending her hand, she smiled at him. "You did it, Elijah," Maya said softly. "You brought justice." Elijah shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "We did it, Maya, and we've got a long way to go." She nodded, understanding the weight of his words. The community had fought hard, but there was still healing to be done. Real change had begun, but the work was only just starting. That evening, Elijah returned to the hospital. The room was quiet, the hum of the machines a steady, soft rhythm in the background. The sterile smell of disinfectant lingered in the air as he took his usual seat by his father's side. His heart felt a little lighter, though still heavy with all that had happened. He had done everything he could, everything his father had taught him to do. Yet the fight was not over, not yet. Elijah looked at his father's face, tracing the familiar lines etched by a life of hardship and triumph. Daniel had always been strong, resilient, but as Elijah sat beside him now, he realized that true strength wasn't just in fighting, it was in the quiet resolve to endure, to keep going even when everything seemed lost. He leaned closer, his voice a soft whisper. "I know you're still in there, Dad. I know you're still fighting, and I'll keep fighting with you." Only the soft beeps of the monitors filled the room. Then, almost imperceptibly, Daniel's fingers twitched. Elijah froze, his heart pounding. The movement was slight, almost nothing, but it was there. Elijah's father's eyelids fluttered, his breath hitching as though his body were slowly stirring from a deep sleep. Elijah leaned in, pulse racing, searching for any further sign of life. A doctor rushed in, followed closely by nurses, but Elijah barely noticed them. His focus was on his father's hand, watching the slight tremor that ran through his fingers. It was small, so small, but it was enough. Daniel was still fighting. In the days that followed, Daniel's condition began to improve. He was far from fully recovered, but hope filled the air, hope that he would wake, hope that he would heal. And as Daniel fought for his life, Elijah continued to fight for justice. The trial of Troy Mitchell was approaching, the investigation into the police department deepening, and the town was beginning to rebuild. Real reform had begun, and though the journey ahead was daunting, there was a growing sense that real, lasting change was finally possible. The town had been shaken, even broken, but out of that brokenness something stronger was emerging, a community that had faced the failures of its systems and was committed to building something better. Sitting beside his father, Elijah reflected on all they had endured, the pain, the struggle, and the resilience that had carried them through. As the sun set over the town, casting long shadows across the streets, Elijah understood that justice was more than just legal victories. It was about healing, about standing up for what was right, and about creating a world where people, like his father, could live without fear. The road ahead was still uncertain, but as Elijah sat by Daniel's side, he knew one thing for sure: they were on the right path.